Question 1. Which approach would be most effective for a certified environmental professional to recommend when advising a utility on integrating significant distributed generation into an aging grid infrastructure, while ensuring compliance with current environmental regulations and promoting grid modernization? Option A. Implement a phased grid modernization plan that includes advanced metering, demand-side management technologies, and smart grid controls, coupled with a comprehensive environmental impact assessment for each new distributed generation interconnection to ensure regulatory compliance and grid stability. Option B. Advocate for a complete overhaul of the grid to a fully decentralized microgrid system, without a detailed assessment of the environmental regulatory landscape or the economic feasibility of such a transition. Option C. Focus on upgrading the existing grid infrastructure to its maximum traditional capacity, with minimal consideration for the unique integration challenges and environmental benefits of distributed generation. Option D. Prioritize the rapid deployment of all available distributed generation sources to maximize renewable energy penetration, deferring grid infrastructure upgrades until operational issues become critical. Correct answer is A. Implement a phased grid modernization plan that includes advanced metering, demand-side management technologies, and smart grid controls, coupled with a comprehensive environmental impact assessment for each new distributed generation interconnection to ensure regulatory compliance and grid stability. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the integration of new, potentially intermittent, distributed generation (DG) sources with the existing grid infrastructure, while adhering to evolving environmental regulations and ensuring grid reliability and resilience. The certified environmental professional, CEP, must consider not only the environmental benefits of DG, but also the technical and regulatory implications of its widespread adoption. Careful judgment is required to select a grid modernization strategy that is both environmentally sound and operationally feasible. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, data-driven assessment of grid impacts and regulatory compliance. This involves understanding the specific environmental regulations governing DG integration, such as those related to emissions, land use, and resource management, and ensuring that grid modernization plans align with these requirements. It also necessitates proactive engagement with stakeholders and a thorough technical evaluation of how DG will affect grid stability, power quality, and operational efficiency. This holistic perspective ensures that environmental goals are met without compromising grid integrity or violating regulatory mandates. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on rapid DG deployment without adequate grid assessment would fail to comply with regulations that mandate grid stability and reliability. Such an approach could lead to operational issues, potential environmental hazards from an unstable grid, and non-compliance with utility interconnection standards and environmental permitting requirements. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes traditional grid upgrades without considering the unique characteristics and environmental benefits of DG would be inefficient and potentially miss opportunities to achieve environmental objectives more cost-effectively. This could also lead to non-compliance with policies encouraging renewable energy integration. A third incorrect approach that neglects stakeholder engagement and public input risks alienating communities and failing to address local environmental concerns, potentially leading to project delays and regulatory hurdles. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant environmental regulations and grid modernization objectives. This involves identifying all potential environmental impacts and benefits associated with DG integration and grid upgrades. The next step is to conduct a detailed technical assessment of grid capacity, stability, and operational requirements. Stakeholder consultation, including with regulatory bodies, utilities, and affected communities, is crucial to gather input and ensure buy-in. Finally, the chosen approach should be evaluated against environmental performance metrics, regulatory compliance, and economic feasibility, ensuring a sustainable and compliant solution. Question 2. The review process indicates that a proposed manufacturing facility plans to discharge treated wastewater containing specific heavy metals and organic compounds into a river designated for recreational use and as a drinking water source. The applicant has submitted a draft permit application, proposing a treatment system that they claim is cost-effective and will significantly reduce pollutant levels, but they have not provided detailed effluent data or a specific technology selection based on best available technology, economically achievable BAT, for their industry sector. What is the most appropriate course of action for the certified environmental professional to recommend regarding the permit application under the Clean Water Act? Option A. Recommend approving the permit based on the applicant's assurance that they will strive to minimize their environmental impact and will implement monitoring as required by a general permit. Option B. Recommend issuing the permit with a condition that the facility must achieve compliance with all standards within 1 year of operation, allowing them to begin operations with their current proposed treatment system. Option C. Recommend requiring the applicant to submit a detailed engineering report demonstrating how their proposed treatment system will meet all applicable effluent limitation guidelines, ELG, and water quality standards, WQS, for the receiving water body, and to identify the specific BAT for their industry. Option D. Recommend denying the permit application outright due to the potential for significant environmental harm, without further technical review of the proposed treatment system. The correct answer is C. Recommend requiring the applicant to submit a detailed engineering report demonstrating how their proposed treatment system will meet all applicable effluent limitation guidelines, ELG, and water quality standards, WQS, for the receiving water body, and to identify the specific BAT for their industry. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential conflict between a proposed industrial facility's operational needs and the stringent requirements of the Clean Water Act, CWA, regarding wastewater discharge. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the certified environmental professional, CEP, to balance the economic viability of a project with the imperative to protect water quality, a core ethical and regulatory responsibility. The CEP must navigate complex permitting processes, interpret scientific data, and apply legal frameworks accurately. The correct approach involves a thorough technical review of the facility's proposed wastewater treatment system and its projected effluent quality against the specific effluent limitation guidelines, ELG, and water quality standards, WQS, established under the CWA for the receiving water body. This includes assessing the adequacy of the proposed best available technology, economically achievable BAT, and ensuring that the discharge will not cause or contribute to a violation of WQS. This approach represents best professional practice because it is directly aligned with the CWA's objective of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. It demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance, scientific integrity, and environmental stewardship, fulfilling the CEP's ethical obligations. An incorrect approach would be to recommend approving the permit based solely on the applicant's assurance that they will do their best to meet standards. This fails to acknowledge the legally binding nature of ELGs and WQS and bypasses the essential technical review required for permit issuance. This represents a significant regulatory failure by not ensuring compliance with the CWA and an ethical failure by prioritizing expediency over environmental protection. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend denial of the permit solely because the proposed treatment technology is the least expensive option available, without a thorough technical assessment of its efficacy. While cost is a factor in BAT determinations, it cannot be the sole determinant if the technology is demonstrably incapable of meeting effluent limitations. This approach risks stifling necessary industrial development without a sound technical or regulatory basis, potentially leading to unnecessary economic impacts and legal challenges. A third incorrect approach would be to suggest that the facility can operate under a general permit without a detailed review, assuming its discharge is minor. General permits are designed for categories of discharges that have minimal individual and cumulative impacts. A facility with potentially significant pollutant loads requires a specific National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permit, which involves a detailed review of its specific discharge characteristics and potential impacts. Relying on a general permit without proper assessment is a regulatory failure and a breach of professional duty. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Understand the project. clearly define the facility's proposed operations and the nature of its environmental impacts, particularly wastewater generation. 2. Identify applicable regulations. Determine all relevant federal, state, and local environmental laws and regulations, focusing on the CWA and its implementing regulations for wastewater discharge. 3. Conduct technical review. Rigorously evaluate the proposed pollution control technologies, treatment systems, and projected effluent quality against established standards and guidelines. 4. Assess environmental impacts. Analyze the potential impact of the proposed discharge on the receiving water body's designated uses and water quality. 5. Engage stakeholders. Communicate with regulatory agencies, the applicant, and potentially the public to gather information and address concerns. 6. Formulate recommendations. Based on the technical and regulatory review, develop clear, defensible recommendations for permit issuance, modification, or denial, ensuring alignment with environmental protection goals and legal requirements. Question 3. The analysis reveals that a proposed industrial development project is facing significant opposition from local communities concerned about its potential impact on a nearby wetland ecosystem. The project proponents emphasize the economic benefits and job creation, framing their perspective through a lens that prioritizes human welfare and economic growth. Environmental consultants are tasked with preparing an environmental impact assessment, considering the principles of environmental ethics and the requirements of federal environmental law, which approach to environmental decision-making would best ensure compliance and responsible stewardship. Option A. Employing a biocentric perspective that aims to protect individual species within the wetland from direct harm, without necessarily considering the broader ecosystem dynamics or the health of non-living environmental components. Option B. Prioritizing an ecocentric perspective that values the intrinsic worth of the wetland ecosystem and its biodiversity, advocating for mitigation measures that preserve ecological functions and resilience. Option C. Adopting an anthropocentric perspective that focuses primarily on the human benefits of the development, such as job creation and economic stimulus, while addressing only those environmental impacts that directly affect human health or economic activities. Option D. Advocating for a purely economic approach that views natural resources as commodities to be exploited for maximum human gain, with environmental considerations only addressed if they pose a direct legal or financial liability. The correct answer is B. Prioritizing an ecocentric perspective that values the intrinsic worth of the wetland ecosystem and its biodiversity, advocating for mitigation measures that preserve ecological functions and resilience. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common challenge for certified environmental professionals, CEP, in navigating conflicting stakeholder interests when developing an environmental impact assessment, IA, for a proposed industrial development. The core of this challenge lies in balancing economic development with ecological preservation, which often hinges on differing environmental worldviews. A CEP must not only understand these worldviews, but also apply them ethically and in accordance with relevant regulations, such as those governed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or state-level equivalents. The correct approach, prioritizing ecocentrism, represents best professional practice because it aligns with the overarching goals of environmental protection mandated by regulations like NEPA. NEPA requires federal agencies to consider the environmental effects of their proposed actions and to explore alternatives. An ecocentric perspective, which values the intrinsic worth of all living organisms and ecosystems, naturally leads to a more thorough consideration of cumulative impacts, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem services, thereby fulfilling the spirit and letter of environmental law. This approach encourages a holistic view, moving beyond purely human-centric concerns to encompass the long-term health and resilience of the environment itself. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to stewardship and intergenerational equity. An anthropocentric approach, while often a starting point due to its focus on human well-being and economic benefits, can lead to regulatory and ethical failures. It may overlook or downplay environmental impacts that do not directly affect human health or economic interests in the short term, potentially violating NEPA mandate to consider all significant environmental effects. For instance, The loss of a specific species might be deemed acceptable if it doesn't immediately impact human resources, even if it has cascading effects on the ecosystem. This worldview can also lead to a failure to adequately consider the rights and interests of future human generations who will inherit the environmental consequences. A biocentric approach, which extends moral consideration to all living organisms, is a step closer to ecocentrism, but can still fall short. While it would prevent the direct harm to individual organisms, it might not fully grasp the interconnectedness of ecosystems or the importance of non-living components, like water bodies or soil, that are crucial for ecological function. This could result in a plan that protects individual species but fails to preserve the habitat or ecological processes necessary for their long-term survival, thus not fully meeting the comprehensive environmental protection goals of regulatory frameworks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly identifying all stakeholders and their respective environmental worldviews and interests. 2. Thoroughly understanding the applicable regulatory framework, e.g., NEPA, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and its requirements for environmental impact assessment and mitigation. 3. Evaluating potential project impacts through the lens of each relevant environmental worldview, but ultimately grounding the assessment and recommendations in the legally mandated and ethically sound ecocentric framework that promotes long-term ecological integrity. 4. Engaging in transparent communication with stakeholders, explaining the rationale behind decisions based on regulatory compliance and best environmental science. Question 4. Compliance review shows that a proposed industrial facility's environmental impact assessment, while meeting minimum Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act standards, disproportionately places increased air pollution burdens on a nearby low-income, predominantly minority community. The project promises significant economic benefits for the wider region. Which ethical framework best guides the environmental professional's recommendation regarding the project's approval? Option A. Maximizing the overall economic benefits for the region, as this contributes to the greatest good for the largest number of people. Option B. Strictly adhering to the letter of current environmental regulations, as long as all permits are technically in order, regardless of the distributional effects. Option C. Focusing on the personal integrity and professional reputation of the environmental consultant, making a decision that feels intuitively right and avoids controversy. Option D. Prioritizing the fair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, ensuring meaningful community involvement, and seeking mitigation strategies that address the disproportionate impacts on the vulnerable community. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing the fair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, ensuring meaningful community involvement, and seeking mitigation strategies that address the disproportionate impacts on the vulnerable community. Explanation. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma for an environmental professional, requiring a nuanced application of ethical frameworks within the context of U.S. environmental regulations. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate economic benefits of a proposed project against potential long-term environmental harm, and the equitable distribution of those harms and benefits across different communities. A professional must navigate competing stakeholder interests, regulatory requirements, and ethical principles to arrive at a defensible decision. The correct approach, grounded in environmental justice principles, prioritizes the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This aligns with the spirit and intent of numerous U.S. environmental statutes and executive orders, such as Executive Order 12,898 on federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. It recognizes that environmental burdens are often disproportionately borne by vulnerable communities, and ethical practice demands proactive mitigation and equitable consideration. This approach represents best professional practice because it seeks to prevent harm, promote fairness, and ensure that all voices are heard in the decision-making process, fostering sustainable and just outcomes. An approach solely focused on utilitarianism, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number, could be ethically flawed if it overlooks the significant harm to a minority group or a low-income community, even if the overall economic benefit is substantial. This would fail to uphold principles of fairness and equity, potentially violating the spirit of environmental justice. A deontological approach, focusing strictly on adherence to rules and duties, might lead to a decision that is technically compliant with existing regulations, but fails to address the underlying ethical concerns of disproportionate impact. For instance, if regulations do not explicitly mandate consideration of cumulative impacts on vulnerable populations, a strict deontological adherence might miss the ethical imperative to go beyond minimum compliance. A virtue ethics approach, emphasizing the character of the decision-maker, could be too subjective if not guided by established ethical principles and regulatory frameworks. While cultivating virtues like integrity and responsibility is crucial, it needs to be applied within a structured ethical and regulatory context to ensure consistent and justifiable outcomes, particularly when dealing with complex societal impacts. The professional decision-making process should involve a thorough assessment of potential environmental impacts, including cumulative effects on vulnerable populations. This requires engaging with affected communities, understanding their concerns, and exploring mitigation strategies that go beyond minimum regulatory requirements. Professionals should consider the principles of environmental justice, seeking to ensure equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. They should also evaluate the long-term sustainability of the project and its impact on public health and welfare, aligning their decisions with both regulatory mandates and ethical imperatives. Question 5. Process analysis reveals that a permitted discharge point into a local river is exhibiting elevated levels of a specific heavy metal pollutant, alongside a significant decrease in dissolved oxygen and a slight increase in pH, while alkalinity and hardness remain within historical ranges. The facility's environmental permit specifies strict limits for the heavy metal, but does not explicitly detail acceptable ranges for pH or dissolved oxygen, though it references general water quality standards for the receiving water body. What is the most professionally responsible approach to address these findings? Option A. Install a sophisticated aeration system to increase dissolved oxygen levels and a pH adjustment system, assuming these are the primary issues, and monitor the heavy metal pollutant to see if it naturally decreases with these changes. Option B. Immediately implement a chemical treatment to neutralize the elevated pH, as this is a direct deviation from typical river conditions, and focus solely on reducing the heavy metal concentration to meet permit limits. Option C. Conduct a detailed investigation into the sources of the heavy metal and the factors contributing to the decreased dissolved oxygen and increased pH, considering potential synergistic effects and the broader implications for the aquatic ecosystem, before proposing a targeted remediation strategy. Option D. Focus exclusively on reducing the heavy metal pollutant to meet the permit's specific discharge limit, as the other parameters are not explicitly defined as violations in the permit. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed investigation into the sources of the heavy metal and the factors contributing to the decreased dissolved oxygen and increased pH, considering potential synergistic effects and the broader implications for the aquatic ecosystem, before proposing a targeted remediation strategy. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, balancing regulatory compliance with practical, cost-effective solutions when faced with unexpected water quality parameters. The professional challenge lies in interpreting complex water chemistry data, pH, alkalinity, hardness, dissolved oxygen, and pollutants, within the context of specific regulatory limits, and then devising a remediation strategy that is both effective and economically viable, while also considering potential environmental impacts. Careful judgment is required to avoid over-engineering or under-remediating. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the underlying causes of the water quality issues before implementing a solution. This involves detailed site investigation, accurate data interpretation, and consideration of multiple treatment options. It aligns with regulatory requirements by aiming to achieve compliance, but it does so through a scientifically sound and systematic process, which is ethically responsible and professionally sound. This approach minimizes the risk of ineffective treatments, wasted resources, and potential environmental harm, An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most readily available or cheapest chemical treatment without understanding the root cause is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a temporary fix that doesn't address the source of the pollution, potentially resulting in ongoing noncompliance and further environmental degradation. It also fails to meet the ethical obligation to protect the environment effectively. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing a complex, expensive treatment system without a clear understanding of the pollutant's behavior or the site-specific conditions is also professionally unsound. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and can lead to significant financial waste and potential operational issues without guaranteeing compliance or environmental protection. It suggests a failure to apply critical thinking and a reliance on a one-size-fits-all solution. A third incorrect approach that involves ignoring the dissolved oxygen levels because they are not explicitly mentioned in the initial permit, while focusing only on other parameters, is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. Dissolved oxygen is a fundamental indicator of aquatic ecosystem health and is often implicitly or explicitly regulated through broader water quality standards designed to protect aquatic life. Neglecting it demonstrates a narrow interpretation of regulatory requirements and a failure to uphold the broader environmental protection mandate. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the regulatory framework and permit requirements. 2. Conducting a comprehensive site assessment to understand the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the water body and potential pollutant sources. 3. Thoroughly analyzing all available water quality data, including pH, alkalinity, hardness, dissolved oxygen, and specific pollutants, in relation to regulatory limits and ecological impact. 4. Evaluating multiple potential remediation strategies, considering their effectiveness, cost, feasibility, and environmental impact. 5. Selecting the most appropriate and sustainable solution based on scientific evidence and regulatory compliance. 6. Implementing the chosen solution with ongoing monitoring and adaptive management. Question 6. During the evaluation of atmospheric conditions contributing to a significant increase in ground-level ozone concentrations in an urban area, which of the following chemical processes is the most direct and critical driver of photochemical smog formation? Option A. The direct emission and dispersion of fine particulate matter from combustion sources. Option B. The photochemical oxidation of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds in the presence of sunlight. Option C. The catalytic conversion of sulfur dioxide to sulfate aerosols. Option D. The atmospheric hydrolysis of chlorofluorocarbons leading to stratospheric ozone depletion. The correct answer is C. The catalytic conversion of sulfur dioxide to sulfate aerosols. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an environmental professional by requiring them to interpret complex atmospheric chemistry concepts within the context of regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the primary contributors to photochemical smog formation and understanding how these relate to specific air quality standards and potential mitigation strategies, all while adhering to the strict regulatory framework of the Certified Environmental Professional exam. Misinterpreting the chemical processes or their regulatory implications could lead to ineffective or non-compliant environmental management plans. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the chemical reactions that drive photochemical smog formation, specifically the role of nitrogen oxides, NOx, and volatile organic compounds, VOC, in the presence of sunlight. This knowledge is directly applicable to interpreting air quality data, assessing the effectiveness of emission control technologies, and developing strategies to meet regulatory limits for ozone, a key component of smog. Best professional practice dictates a science-based approach that aligns with established air quality regulations, such as those promulgated under the Clean Air Act, assuming U.S. jurisdiction for this exam. This ensures that proposed solutions are both scientifically sound and legally defensible. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to focus solely on particulate matter, PM, as the primary driver of photochemical smog. While PM is a significant air pollutant, it is not the direct precursor to the chemical reactions that form ground-level ozone, the main component of smog. This approach fails to grasp the fundamental photochemistry involved and would lead to misdirected mitigation efforts, violating the principle of scientific accuracy in environmental assessment. Another incorrect approach would be to attribute smog formation primarily to sulfur dioxide, SO2. SO2 is a major contributor to acid rain and respiratory issues, but plays a minimal direct role in the photochemical reactions that create ozone. Focusing on SO2 would represent a failure to understand the specific chemical pathways of smog formation, leading to non-compliance with regulations targeting ozone levels. A third incorrect approach would be to consider only the direct emissions from industrial stacks without accounting for secondary pollutant formation. Photochemical smog is a secondary pollutant, meaning it forms in the atmosphere through chemical reactions of primary pollutants. Ignoring this secondary formation process would lead to an incomplete and inaccurate assessment of air quality impacts, and would not align with regulatory frameworks that address ambient air quality standards. Professional reasoning. Environmental professionals must first establish a strong foundation in the scientific principles governing air chemistry. This understanding then needs to be rigorously applied within the specific legal and regulatory context of their jurisdiction. When faced with a scenario like this, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the core environmental issue, photochemical smog. 2. Recalling the relevant chemical reactions and precursors, NOx, VOx, sunlight. 3. Linking these to applicable air quality standards and regulations, e.g., National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone. And 4. Evaluating potential solutions based on their scientific efficacy and regulatory compliance. This systematic approach ensures that assessments are accurate, recommendations are practical, and compliance is achieved. Question 7. The performance metrics show the presence of several aromatic hydrocarbons, including benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes BTEX, along with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PA, such as naphthalene and phenanthrene, in soil samples from a former industrial site. Analytical reports also indicate the presence of specific functional groups within some of these compounds that may influence their environmental behavior. Considering the U.S. EPA regulatory framework for contaminated site assessment and remediation, which of the following approaches best reflects professional practice in evaluating these findings? Option A. Focus solely on the BTEX compounds, as they are typically more volatile and commonly regulated, and disregard the PAHs and other identified functional groups unless their concentrations exceed very high generic thresholds. Option B. Recommend immediate excavation and off-site disposal of all soil exhibiting any detectable level of hydrocarbons, without further investigation into the specific compounds, their concentrations, or their functional group implications, to ensure rapid removal. Option C. Conduct a detailed risk assessment that considers the specific toxicity and environmental fate of each identified hydrocarbon and PAH, taking into account the implications of their functional groups, and compare these findings against relevant U.S. EPA soil cleanup standards and state-specific regulations. Option D. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the total concentration of BTEX and PAHs, assuming that compounds with similar functional groups will behave identically in the environment and respond to the same remediation techniques. The correct answer is D. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the total concentration of BTEX and PAHs, assuming that compounds with similar functional groups will behave identically in the environment and respond to the same remediation techniques. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, interpreting complex analytical data in the context of regulatory compliance and potential environmental impact. The presence of various hydrocarbon compounds, including specific functional groups, necessitates a thorough understanding of organic chemistry principles to accurately assess risks and determine appropriate remediation strategies. The challenge lies in distinguishing between naturally occurring hydrocarbons and those indicative of contamination, and in understanding the implications of different functional groups for persistence, toxicity, and degradation pathways. Professional judgment is required to connect analytical findings to specific regulatory requirements and best management practices. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of the analytical results, correlating the identified hydrocarbon compounds and their functional groups with established environmental quality standards and regulatory limits. This requires referencing the relevant U.S. EPA regulations, e.g., CERCLA Clean Water Act, and state-specific environmental laws that govern the assessment and remediation of contaminated sites. Understanding the chemical properties of the identified compounds, such as their volatility, solubility, and potential for bioaccumulation, is crucial for risk assessment. The professional must then translate this understanding into actionable recommendations that align with regulatory mandates and promote environmental protection. This approach demonstrates a commitment to data-driven decision-making and adherence to legal and ethical obligations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the findings solely because the total hydrocarbon concentration falls below a general screening level without considering the specific types of hydrocarbons and their associated functional groups. This fails to acknowledge that certain compounds, even at lower concentration, can pose significant risks due to their toxicity or persistence. This approach violates the principle of thorough site characterization mandated by regulations like CERCLA, which requires a comprehensive assessment of all potential contaminants. Another incorrect approach would be to focus only on the most abundant hydrocarbon without investigating the presence and potential impact of less abundant but more hazardous compounds, or those with specific functional groups known to be recalcitrant or toxic. The selective analysis ignores the cumulative risk posed by a mixture of contaminants and could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate risk assessment, contravening the precautionary principle and regulatory requirements for evaluating all relevant constituents. A third incorrect approach would be to propose remediation based on generic assumptions about hydrocarbon degradation, without considering the specific chemical structures and functional groups present. Different functional groups can drastically alter a compound's susceptibility to various remediation technologies. This approach risks selecting ineffective or even counterproductive remediation methods, leading to prolonged contamination and potential noncompliance with regulatory cleanup goals. Professional reasoning. When faced with such analytical data, an environmental professional should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, identify all detected hydrocarbon compounds and their concentrations. Second, research the regulatory context, including applicable federal U.S. EPA and state environmental standards for these specific compounds or classes of compounds. Third, analyze the chemical properties and functional groups of the identified hydrocarbons to understand their potential environmental fate, transport, and toxicity. Fourth, conduct a risk assessment, considering the potential exposure pathways and the toxicity of the identified substances. Finally, develop a remediation strategy that is technically sound, cost-effective, and compliant with all relevant regulations, prioritizing the protection of human health and the environment. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates a growing concern regarding the long-term environmental and social impacts of a proposed industrial expansion project. The project aims to increase production capacity, which is expected to boost local employment and economic activity. However, some community groups have raised alarms about potential water contamination and increased traffic congestion, while environmental NGOs are concerned about habitat disruption. As the lead environmental professional, how should you best approach evaluating the project's sustainability in light of the Brundtland Report's definition of sustainable development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG? Option A. Prioritize addressing the concerns of the most vocal community groups and environmental NGOs to ensure public acceptance and avoid potential project delays. Option B. Focus on implementing the most cost-effective pollution control technologies available to mitigate immediate environmental concerns, as this will likely satisfy regulatory requirements and reduce operational expenses. Option C. Identify a single SDG that the project most directly contributes to, such as SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and ensure all efforts are focused on maximizing achievement of that specific goal. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment that integrates environmental impact analysis, social equity considerations, and economic viability projections, seeking solutions that create synergies across the three pillars of sustainable development and contribute to relevant SDGs. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment that integrates environmental impact analysis, social equity considerations, and economic viability projections, seeking solutions that create synergies across the three pillars of sustainable development and contribute to relevant SDGs. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, balancing competing stakeholder interests while adhering to the foundational principles of sustainable development. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying the broad, aspirational goals of the Brundtland Report and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, to concrete operational decisions. This requires a nuanced understanding of how environmental protection, economic viability, and social equity intersect, and how to prioritize actions that contribute to long-term well-being without causing undue harm. Careful judgment is required to avoid short-term gains that undermine future sustainability or to dismiss valid concerns from specific stakeholder groups. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly engages with the core tenets of sustainable development as defined by the Brundtland Report and operationalized by the SDGs. Specifically, it prioritizes a holistic assessment that considers environmental impacts, social equity, and economic feasibility. This aligns with the integrated nature of sustainable development, which recognizes that these three pillars are interdependent. By seeking to identify synergies and trade-offs, the professional demonstrates a commitment to finding solutions that are not only environmentally sound, but also socially just and economically viable in the long term, thereby fulfilling the spirit and intent of the SDGs. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction fails to acknowledge the long-term economic implications of environmental degradation and social inequity, which are central to the Brundtland definition of sustainable development. This approach risks creating future liabilities and undermining the very economic viability it seeks to enhance. Ethically, it neglects the intergenerational equity principle inherent in sustainable development. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the most vocal stakeholder group, without a comprehensive assessment of broader impacts, risks creating new inequities or overlooking critical environmental issues. This is a failure to uphold the social equity pillar of sustainable development and can lead to regulatory noncompliance or reputational damage. It also fails to consider the interconnectedness of the SDGs, which often require broad consensus and multi-stakeholder engagement. A third incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on achieving a single, isolated SDG without considering its potential impact on other SDGs or the broader sustainability framework is also professionally deficient. The SDGs are designed to be integrated and indivisible. Focusing on one in isolation can lead to unintended negative consequences for other critical areas of sustainable development, such as poverty reduction or responsible consumption. This demonstrates a superficial understanding of the interconnected nature of global sustainability challenges. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Define the problem and its scope, clearly identifying the environmental, social, and economic dimensions. 2. Identify all relevant stakeholders and their perspectives, ensuring diverse voices are heard. 3. Consult the foundational principles of sustainable development Brundtland Report and relevant SDGs to establish a guiding framework. 4. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that considers both immediate and long-term consequences across all three pillars of sustainability. 5. Explore a range of potential solutions, evaluating their feasibility, effectiveness, and alignment with sustainability principles. 6. Prioritize solutions that demonstrate synergy across the environmental, social, and economic dimensions, and that contribute to multiple, interconnected SDGs. 7. Engage in transparent communication and collaboration with stakeholders throughout the process. Question 9. Regulatory review indicates a manufacturing facility is proposing to alter its wastewater treatment process to reduce operational costs. The proposed changes involve bypassing a secondary treatment stage and discharging effluent directly to a municipal sewer system, which the facility believes has sufficient capacity. The facility's environmental manager, a certified environmental professional, is tasked with evaluating this proposal. Which of the following approaches best aligns with U.S. federal environmental regulations and professional ethical standards? Option A. Implement the cost-saving measure immediately, assuming the municipal sewer system can handle the increased pollutant load and that the bypass will not violate any CWA provisions. Option B. Proceed with the bypass only if the facility's internal environmental audit indicates no immediate signs of pollution, deferring a formal risk assessment until a regulatory inspection occurs. Option C. Focus solely on the projected cost savings, as the primary goal is to improve the company's financial performance, and environmental compliance can be addressed if specifically mandated by regulators. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to determine if the bypass treatment stage is essential for meeting Clean Water Act, CWA effluent limitations, and National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permit requirements, and consult with the local publicly owned treatment works, POTWA, regarding the proposed discharge. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment to determine if the bypass treatment stage is essential for meeting Clean Water Act, CWA, effluent limitations, and National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permit requirements, and consult with the local publicly owned treatment works, POTWA, regarding the proposed discharge. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate cost-saving measures and long-term environmental compliance and public health protection. A certified environmental professional, CEP, must navigate these competing interests while adhering strictly to U.S. federal environmental regulations, specifically the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) and the Clean Water Act (CWA). The professional judgment required involves understanding the potential environmental impacts of the proposed shortcuts, the legal ramifications of noncompliance, and the ethical obligation to protect human health and the environment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven assessment of the proposed changes against established regulatory standards. This involves consulting relevant regulations, RCRA for hazardous waste management, CWA for wastewater discharge, conducting site-specific risk assessments, and engaging with regulatory agencies when necessary. This proactive and compliant approach ensures that environmental protection is not compromised for economic expediency and upholds the CEP's ethical and legal responsibilities. An incorrect approach that suggests proceeding with the changes without adequate assessment fails to meet the fundamental requirements of RCRA and CWA. This could lead to improper waste handling, illegal discharge of pollutants, and significant penalties. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on cost reduction without considering environmental implications, demonstrates a severe ethical lapse and regulatory ignorance. It disregards the principle of environmental stewardship and the legal mandate to prevent pollution. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying necessary environmental controls due to budget constraints without a clear plan for future compliance, is also professionally unacceptable. This passive stance can exacerbate environmental damage and lead to greater remediation costs and legal liabilities in the long run, violating the spirit and letter of environmental laws. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation. 1. Identify the proposed change and its potential environmental implications. 2. Consult applicable U.S. federal regulations, RCRA, CWA, etc., and state/local equivalents. 3. Assess the risks associated with the proposed change, considering both environmental and human health impacts. 4. Evaluate the economic benefits against the potential environmental and legal costs of noncompliance. 5. If uncertainty exists or the proposed change deviates from standard practice, consult with legal counsel or regulatory experts. 6. Document all assessments, decisions, and communications thoroughly. 7. Prioritize compliance and environmental protection, even if it incurs higher initial costs. Question 10. Market research demonstrates significant demand for a new commercial development on a previously undeveloped parcel of land. The developer, eager to capitalize on this demand, has requested an expedited environmental review process. As a certified environmental professional tasked with overseeing this project in the United States, what is the most appropriate best practice approach to ensure regulatory compliance and responsible environmental stewardship? Option A. Conduct a brief site visit and prepare a summary report based on general knowledge of the area, deeming the project low risk and sufficient for regulatory approval without further formal assessment. Option B. Focus solely on the economic feasibility and market demand, deferring all environmental considerations to the construction phase to avoid project delays. Option C. Proceed with the development based on the market research, assuming minimal environmental impact due to the parcel's undeveloped nature, and address any unforeseen issues as they arise during construction. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive environmental review process, including a site assessment, and if necessary, a formal environmental assessment or environmental impact statement in accordance with NEPA and applicable state laws, to thoroughly evaluate potential environmental impacts before proceeding. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive environmental review process, including a site assessment, and if necessary, a formal environmental assessment, or environmental impact statement, in accordance with NEPA and applicable state laws, to thoroughly evaluate potential environmental impacts before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental professionals, CEP, in the United States, balancing the need for efficient project development with stringent environmental regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex federal and state environmental laws, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and state-specific equivalents, to a novel situation. The professional must exercise sound judgment to determine the appropriate level of environmental review without unduly delaying a project that has demonstrated market demand, while also avoiding potential legal challenges and environmental harm. The correct approach, which involves conducting a thorough initial site assessment, and if warranted, proceeding with a formal environmental assessment or environmental impact statement as dictated by NEPA and relevant state laws, represents best professional practice. This methodical process ensures that potential environmental impacts are identified, analyzed, and mitigated in accordance with legal requirements. It upholds the ethical obligation of the CEP to protect the environment and public welfare, and it aligns with the principles of transparency and public participation mandated by environmental statutes. This approach minimizes the risk of non-compliance, future remediation costs, and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to bypass the formal environmental review process based solely on the market research findings. This failure to adhere to the procedural requirements of NEPA and state environmental laws is a direct regulatory failure. It demonstrates a disregard for the legal mandate to assess environmental consequences before project implementation, potentially leading to significant legal penalties, project delays due to enforcement actions, and irreversible environmental damage. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review that does not adequately identify or analyze potential impacts, even if some documentation is generated. This constitutes an ethical failure to perform due diligence and a regulatory failure to meet the substantive requirements of environmental review. It prioritizes expediency over environmental protection and accurate assessment, undermining the integrity of the environmental professional's role. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the project's scope and potential for environmental interaction. This involves consulting relevant federal, state, and local environmental regulations. The next step is to gather preliminary information through site reconnaissance and data review. Based on this information, the professional must then determine the appropriate level of environmental review required by law. This decision should be documented and justified, and if a formal review is necessary, it must be conducted thoroughly and transparently, engaging stakeholders as required. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that a newly identified contaminant in a local water supply exhibits a clear dose-response relationship in laboratory studies, with observable adverse effects at varying exposure levels. Preliminary data also suggests a potential for bioaccumulation within aquatic organisms. As a certified environmental professional, CEP, operating under U.S. regulatory frameworks, what is the most appropriate approach to assessing the environmental and health risks associated with this contaminant and informing potential regulatory actions? Option A. Focus solely on the highest dose at which no adverse effects were observed in the laboratory studies, assuming this level is safe for all environmental and human exposures. Option B. Prioritize the development of cost-effective treatment technologies for the contaminant, deferring detailed toxicological analysis until after implementation. Option C. Recommend immediate cessation of all water use based on the mere presence of the contaminant, without further detailed toxicological evaluation. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive toxicological risk assessment that integrates the dose-response data, evaluates the toxicity pathway and bioaccumulation potential, and applies appropriate uncertainty factors to derive protective exposure limits. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive toxicological risk assessment that integrates the dose-response data, evaluates the toxicity pathway and bioaccumulation potential, and applies appropriate uncertainty factors to derive protective exposure limits. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental professionals, CEP, in the U.S. regulatory context. The core difficulty lies in interpreting and applying complex dose-response data for a newly identified contaminant in a way that aligns with established regulatory frameworks and best scientific practices. The CEP must balance the need for protective environmental standards with the practicalities of data interpretation and the potential for significant economic and societal impacts based on their recommendations. The challenge is amplified by the potential for differing interpretations of the toxicology data and the need to communicate these complexities to stakeholders who may not have a scientific background. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the dose-response data, considering the specific toxicity pathway and potential for bioaccumulation of the contaminant. This approach aligns with the principles of risk assessment as mandated by U.S. environmental regulations, such as the Toxic Substances Control Act (TSCA) and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act (CERCLA). It requires the CEP to identify the most sensitive endpoints, evaluate the uncertainty associated with the data, e.g., extrapolation from animal studies to human, variability in human susceptibility, and consider established methodologies for deriving acceptable exposure levels or cleanup standards. This systematic, science-based approach ensures that regulatory decisions are grounded in the best available scientific evidence and adhere to the precautionary principle where appropriate, while also acknowledging data limitations. The CEP's role is to translate this scientific understanding into actionable recommendations that protect public health and the environment within the existing legal and regulatory framework. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the highest observed effect level whole from the dose-response study without considering dose-response relationships, toxicity pathways, or bioaccumulation potential. This fails to account for the dose-response curve, which is fundamental to toxicology, and ignores the possibility of adverse effects at lower doses. It also bypasses the critical step of applying uncertainty factors, which are legally and ethically required to account for interspecies and intraspecies variability, as well as data limitations. This approach is scientifically unsound and would likely lead to either overly stringent or insufficiently protective regulations, violating the principles of sound risk assessment and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the contaminant's potential for bioaccumulation without a thorough scientific evaluation of its physicochemical properties and metabolic fate. Bioaccumulation is a critical factor in determining long-term environmental and human health risks, as it can lead to increasing concentrations of a substance in organisms over time, potentially reaching toxic levels even if initial exposure concentrations are low. Ignoring this aspect, without justification based on scientific data, would be a failure to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment as required by U.S. environmental law, potentially leading to underestimation of the overall risk and inadequate protective measures. A third incorrect approach would be to base recommendations solely on the economic feasibility of remediation or control measures, rather than on the scientific assessment of toxicity and exposure. While economic considerations are often part of the regulatory decision-making process, the initial scientific and toxicological assessment must be independent and robust. Prioritizing cost over scientific evidence of harm would be an ethical failure and a violation of the CEP's professional responsibility to protect public health and the environment. This approach undermines the integrity of the environmental protection framework. Professional reasoning. When faced with novel toxicological data, a CEP should first conduct a comprehensive literature review to understand existing knowledge about the contaminant and similar substances. This should be followed by a detailed analysis of the provided dose-response data, identifying critical endpoints and understanding the shape of the dose-response curve. The CEP must then evaluate the toxicity pathway and bioaccumulation potential, considering relevant U.S. EPA guidance documents and scientific literature. Uncertainty analysis is paramount, involving the identification and quantification of uncertainties in the data and the application of appropriate uncertainty factors. Finally, the CEP should synthesize this information into a risk assessment that informs regulatory recommendations, clearly articulating assumptions, limitations, and the scientific basis for their conclusions. This structured, evidence-based approach ensures that recommendations are scientifically defensible, legally compliant, and ethically sound. Question 12. Implementation of a new residential development is proposed adjacent to a sensitive freshwater wetland ecosystem. The development is expected to significantly increase the local human population density, leading to increased wastewater discharge and potential for stormwater runoff containing elevated nutrient levels. As a certified environmental professional tasked with assessing the environmental implications, which approach best aligns with regulatory compliance and sound ecological practice under the U.S. regulatory framework, specifically considering population ecology principles related to carrying capacity and population dynamics. Option A. Argue that the concept of carrying capacity is an abstract ecological theory with no direct legal standing under the Clean Water Act, and therefore no specific assessment of its impact is required beyond standard discharge permits. Option B. Focus solely on historical water quality data for the wetland, assuming that past conditions are indicative of future resilience and that the proposed development will not significantly alter the existing population dynamics of the wetland's flora and fauna. Option C. Prioritize the economic benefits of the development and recommend proceeding with construction, assuming that any potential ecological impacts will be minor and can be addressed through post-construction monitoring without a pre-development carrying capacity analysis. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the wetland's current and projected carrying capacity, considering the cumulative impacts of increased nutrient loading and habitat alteration from the proposed development, and propose mitigation measures to ensure the ecosystem's long-term health and compliance with the Clean Water Act. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the wetland's current and projected carrying capacity, considering the cumulative impacts of increased nutrient loading and habitat alteration from the proposed development, and propose mitigation measures to ensure the ecosystem's long-term health and compliance with the Clean Water Act. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing ecological principles of population dynamics and carrying capacity with the practical realities of regulatory compliance and stakeholder engagement. A certified environmental professional must not only understand the theoretical underpinnings of population ecology, but also how to apply this knowledge within a specific legal and ethical framework. The challenge lies in translating scientific understanding into actionable, compliant, and defensible environmental management strategies. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory mandate of assessing and mitigating potential environmental impacts. By focusing on the specific requirements of the Clean Water Act, CWA, and its associated regulations, such as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permitting process, the professional demonstrates adherence to established legal frameworks. This approach involves a scientifically sound assessment of the proposed development's potential to exceed the carrying capacity of the local aquatic ecosystem, considering factors like nutrient loading and habitat alteration. It prioritizes data-driven decision-making and proactive mitigation strategies, aligning with the ethical obligation to protect environmental resources and comply with federal law. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate economic benefits over ecological assessment fails to meet regulatory requirements. CWA mandates that discharges into navigable waters must be regulated to protect water quality. Ignoring potential impacts on the carrying capacity of the receiving waters, such as increased nutrient loads from development, directly contravenes the spirit and letter of the CWA. This approach represents a significant ethical failure by prioritizing short-term economic gains over long-term environmental health and public welfare, potentially leading to severe legal penalties and irreversible ecological damage. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on historical population data without considering the impact of the proposed development is also professionally unacceptable. While historical data is valuable, it does not account for the novel stressors introduced by new development. The CWA requires an assessment of potential impacts, not just a review of past conditions. Failing to incorporate the projected effects of increased population density, wastewater discharge, and habitat modification into the carrying capacity analysis is a regulatory failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an inability to anticipate and manage future environmental risks, which is a core responsibility of a certified environmental professional. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the carrying capacity concept as purely theoretical and not legally binding misunderstands the practical application of ecological principles within environmental law. Regulatory agencies frequently use carrying capacity concepts, often implicitly, when setting effluent limitations, establishing water quality standards, and evaluating the environmental impact of proposed projects. Ignoring this fundamental ecological principle means failing to adequately assess the potential for environmental degradation, which is a direct violation of the professional's duty to uphold environmental protection standards mandated by laws like the CWA. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the relevant regulatory framework and specific legal requirements applicable to the project. 2. Conduct a thorough environmental baseline assessment, incorporating relevant ecological principles like population dynamics and carrying capacity. 3. Analyze the potential impacts of the proposed project on the identified environmental parameters, considering both direct and indirect effects. 4. Develop mitigation strategies to avoid, minimize, or offset any identified adverse impacts, ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations. 5. Document all assessments, analyses, and proposed actions clearly and comprehensively for regulatory review and public record. 6. Engage with stakeholders, including regulatory agencies and the public, to ensure transparency and address concerns. Question 13. Operational review demonstrates that a proposed industrial park is slated for development adjacent to a known critical habitat for the federally listed endangered species, the azure butterfly. Regional ecological assessments have indicated a significant increase in habitat fragmentation and the proliferation of invasive plant species, such as garlic mustard, Alaria petiolata, within the broader landscape over the past decade. Furthermore, climate change projections for the region suggest an increase in drought frequency and intensity, which could stress native plant communities essential for the azure butterfly's life cycle. Considering these factors, which of the following approaches best represents professional best practice for an environmental consultant tasked with assessing the project's potential impacts and recommending mitigation strategies? Option A. Prepare a brief report highlighting the economic benefits of the industrial park and downplaying the potential ecological risks, citing the lack of immediate, observable catastrophic impacts on the azure butterfly population to date. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, IA, that includes detailed ecological surveys to map the critical habitat, quantify the extent of fragmentation and invasive species presence, and model the potential impacts of drought on native flora. Develop specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART mitigation measures, such as establishing wildlife corridors, implementing a long-term invasive species management plan, and proposing habitat restoration efforts focused on drought-resilient native plants. Option C. Recommend the immediate relocation of the azure butterfly population to a more distant, seemingly undisturbed area, without conducting extensive research on the species' specific habitat needs or the ecological viability of the proposed new location. Option D. Focus the assessment primarily on ensuring compliance with minimum regulatory permit requirements, assuming that standard development practices will inherently minimize ecological disruption. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment IA that includes detailed ecological surveys to map the critical habitat, quantify the extent of fragmentation and invasive species presence, and model the potential impacts of drought on native flora. Develop specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART mitigation measures, such as establishing wildlife corridors, implementing a long-term invasive species management plan, and proposing habitat restoration efforts focused on drought-resilient native plants. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, balancing development pressures with the imperative of biodiversity conservation. the proposed industrial park's location within a known critical habitat for a threatened species, coupled with the documented impacts of habitat fragmentation and invasive species in the region, creates a complex decision-making environment. The professional challenge lies in navigating the legal requirements for environmental protection against economic development interests, ensuring that decisions are scientifically sound, ethically defensible, and compliant with all applicable regulations. The presence of climate change as an exacerbating factor adds another layer of complexity, requiring consideration of long-term ecological resilience. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough, science-based assessment of potential impacts and the development of robust mitigation and management strategies that are legally mandated and ethically sound. This involves conducting detailed ecological surveys to accurately delineate the critical habitat, assessing the specific threats posed by the proposed development, including fragmentation and invasive species introduction, and evaluating the cumulative impacts in the context of climate change projections. Developing a comprehensive environmental impact assessment (IA) that includes specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART, mitigation measures, such as habitat restoration, invasive species control plans, and wildlife corridor establishment, directly addresses the legal obligations under environmental protection statutes and best practices in conservation biology. This approach demonstrates a commitment to the principles of environmental stewardship and the precautionary principle, ensuring that development proceeds only with demonstrably minimized harm to sensitive ecosystems and species. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on economic feasibility and regulatory compliance without a deep ecological understanding fails to meet professional standards. This would involve superficial impact assessments and the implementation of minimal, often ineffective, mitigation measures simply to satisfy minimum legal requirements. This approach is ethically flawed as it prioritizes short-term economic gains over long-term ecological integrity and the protection of threatened species, violating the spirit of environmental legislation. It also risks significant legal challenges and reputational damage if the inadequacy of the mitigation is later exposed. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the concerns based on anecdotal evidence or a lack of immediate, visible impacts. This ignores the scientific consensus on habitat fragmentation, invasive species, and climate change, which often have insidious and long-term consequences. Ethically, this demonstrates negligence and a failure to exercise due diligence. Legally, it could lead to non-compliance with environmental protection laws that require proactive assessment and management of potential risks, even if those risks are not immediately apparent. A third incorrect approach might involve proposing mitigation measures that are not scientifically validated or are logistically unfeasible. This could include vague promises of restoration without specific plans or timelines, or the suggestion of relocating the species without adequate research into the success rates and potential negative consequences of such actions. This approach is professionally irresponsible, as it fails to provide genuine protection and may create a false sense of security, leading to continued ecological degradation and potential legal repercussions for misrepresentation. Professional reasoning. Environmental professionals must adopt a systematic, evidence-based decision-making process. This begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, followed by rigorous scientific investigation to characterize the environmental baseline and potential impacts. The process should involve stakeholder engagement, including scientific experts and regulatory bodies. When faced with conflicting interests, professionals must prioritize the protection of environmental resources as mandated by law and ethical principles, advocating for the most effective and scientifically sound mitigation and management strategies. This requires critical evaluation of all proposed approaches, ensuring they are not only compliant, but also ecologically robust and sustainable. Question 14. The control framework reveals a proposed industrial expansion project that will involve significant excavation, the potential generation of hazardous waste, and increased stormwater runoff into a nearby tributary. The project also requires clearing a portion of land that may contain sensitive habitats. As a certified environmental professional overseeing this project, which approach best ensures compliance with U.S. environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, CERCLA, ARCRA, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act. Option A. Expedite the project by minimizing environmental assessments, focusing only on the most critical regulatory requirements to avoid delays and cost overruns. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive NEPA review to assess potential impacts across all environmental media, develop a RCRA-compliant hazardous waste management plan, secure necessary Clean Water Act permits for stormwater and wastewater discharges, and conduct an ESA consultation if sensitive habitats are identified. Option C. Focus solely on obtaining the required Clean Water Act permits for stormwater and wastewater discharges, as this is the most immediate concern for the tributary. Option D. Prioritize the development of a RCRA-compliant hazardous waste management plan, assuming that other environmental concerns will be addressed as they arise during construction. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive NEPA review to assess potential impacts across all environmental media, develop a RCRA-compliant hazardous waste management plan, secure necessary Clean Water Act permits for stormwater and wastewater discharges, and conduct an ESA consultation if sensitive habitats are identified. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, balancing the need for economic development with stringent environmental protection mandates under U.S. federal law. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying multiple, sometimes overlapping, regulatory frameworks to a complex project, ensuring compliance while also facilitating responsible progress. Careful judgment is required to identify the most pertinent regulations and to determine the appropriate scope and depth of environmental assessment and mitigation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically addresses the project's potential environmental impacts through the lens of the most relevant U.S. environmental laws. It prioritizes a thorough NEPA review to identify potential impacts across various environmental media, followed by specific compliance actions under RCRA for hazardous waste management and the Clean Water Act for stormwater and wastewater discharges. This integrated approach ensures that all major environmental concerns are proactively identified and managed according to statutory requirements, demonstrating due diligence and a commitment to environmental stewardship. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on RCRA compliance would be professionally unacceptable because it ignores potential impacts on water quality and broader environmental consequences that NEPA is designed to uncover. This failure to conduct a comprehensive environmental review violates the spirit and letter of NEPA, which mandates consideration of all significant environmental effects. Another incorrect approach that only addresses Clean Water Act permits without considering hazardous waste generation or broader ecological impacts would be similarly deficient. This selective compliance overlooks critical regulatory obligations and potential liabilities. An approach that prioritizes economic expediency over thorough environmental assessment, perhaps by downplaying potential impacts or seeking to bypass required reviews, represents a severe ethical and regulatory failure. It undermines the integrity of environmental protection efforts and exposes the organization to significant legal penalties and reputational damage. Professional reasoning in such situations should involve a phased approach. First, conducting a preliminary assessment to identify all potentially applicable U.S. environmental laws NEPA, CWA, RCRA, CERCLA, ESA, CA. Second, determining the scope and type of NEPA review required based on the project's potential for significant environmental effects. Third, developing specific compliance strategies for each identified regulatory area, ensuring that permits are obtained, waste is managed appropriately, and potential impacts on threatened or endangered species are addressed. Finally, maintaining clear documentation of all assessments, decisions, and compliance activities is crucial for demonstrating adherence to legal requirements and best practices. Question 15. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing advanced oxidation processes, AOP, for disinfection offers superior pathogen inactivation and DBP precursor removal compared to traditional chlorination, but has significantly higher initial capital and operational cost. Considering the certified environmental professionals' ethical and regulatory obligations under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which approach best balances public health protection with economic feasibility. Option A. Recommend continuing with traditional chlorination due to its lower immediate cost, assuming that current regulatory limits for DBPs are met and deferring investment in AOPs until technology costs decrease or regulations become more stringent. Option B. Recommend the installation of AOPs immediately, prioritizing pathogen inactivation and DBP reduction above all other considerations, regardless of the financial burden on the water utility. Option C. Recommend a hybrid approach that combines chlorination with a targeted DBP removal technology, such as activated carbon adsorption, to mitigate DBP formation while keeping costs lower than full AOP implementation. Option D. Recommend the implementation of AOPs, supported by a detailed risk assessment demonstrating long-term public health benefits and a phased implementation plan to manage costs, while also advocating for continued monitoring and research into DBP formation. Correct answer is D. Recommend the implementation of AOPs, supported by a detailed risk assessment demonstrating long-term public health benefits and a phased implementation plan to manage costs, while also advocating for continued monitoring and research into DBP formation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing public health protection with economic considerations in the context of drinking water disinfection. The certified environmental professional (CEP) must navigate the complexities of regulatory compliance, scientific efficacy of different disinfection methods, and the financial implications for the water utility and its customers. The inherent uncertainty in predicting long-term health impacts from residual disinfection byproducts, DBP, versus the immediate risk of waterborne pathogens necessitates a robust and defensible decision-making process. The CEP's role is to provide objective, science-based recommendations that align with regulatory mandates and best practices. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes public health and regulatory compliance by selecting a disinfection method that effectively inactivates pathogens while minimizing the formation of harmful DBPs, supported by a thorough risk assessment and consideration of emerging research. This aligns with the Safe Drinking Water Act (SDWA) and its associated regulations, such as the Disinfectants and Disinfection Byproducts Rule Stage 1 and Stage 2 DBPR. Best professional practice dictates that the primary objective of drinking water treatment is to provide safe water, and any cost-benefit analysis must weigh the costs of achieving this safety against the potential costs of public health impacts from inadequate treatment or excessive DBP formation. This approach demonstrates adherence to the ethical obligation of the CEP to protect public health and the environment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the lowest initial capital and operational costs without adequately assessing the long-term health risks associated with the chosen disinfection method or its DBP formation potential. This fails to meet the regulatory requirements of the SDWA, which mandates minimizing both microbial contamination and harmful DBPs. Ethically, it prioritizes economic expediency over public health, a clear violation of professional responsibility. Another incorrect approach would be to select a disinfection method based solely on its perceived effectiveness in inactivating a broad spectrum of pathogens, without considering the potential for forming regulated or emerging DBPs. While pathogen inactivation is critical, ignoring DBP formation can lead to future regulatory noncompliance and potential health issues, undermining the overall goal of providing safe drinking water. This approach demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding of the integrated nature of drinking water treatment regulations. A third incorrect approach would be to delay implementation of a more robust disinfection strategy due to ongoing research into DBP impacts, opting for a wait-and-see approach. While research is important, regulatory frameworks often provide guidance for managing known risks. Unnecessary delays in implementing effective treatment can expose the public to preventable health risks and may lead to future enforcement actions if regulations are not met. This approach fails to exercise due diligence in protecting public health. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic risk management framework. This involves identifying potential hazards, pathogens, DBP, assessing the likelihood and severity of adverse outcomes, evaluating available control measures, disinfection technologies, and selecting the most appropriate strategy based on a comprehensive evaluation of efficacy, cost, regulatory compliance, and public health protection. This decision-making process should be iterative, incorporating new scientific information and regulatory updates. The CEP must be able to articulate the rationale behind their recommendations, demonstrating a clear understanding of the scientific, regulatory, and ethical dimensions of the decision. Question 16. Investigation of an industrial facility's air quality monitoring program reveals a need for process optimization. The certified environmental professional is tasked with recommending improvements to ensure regulatory compliance and cost-effectiveness. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a process optimization strategy for air quality monitoring? Option A. Immediately expand the ambient air monitoring network to include continuous monitors at all potential emission points and along the entire facility boundary, regardless of historical data or specific pollutant concerns. Option B. Implement a monitoring plan based solely on historical monitoring data from 5 years ago, without re-evaluating current operational changes or updated regulatory requirements. Option C. Rely exclusively on the most recent source testing reports for all identified emission sources, assuming ambient air quality is adequately protected if point source emissions are within permitted limits. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing ambient air quality data, facility emission inventories, meteorological data, and relevant federal and state air quality regulations to inform the design of a targeted ambient monitoring network and source testing schedule. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing ambient air quality data, facility emission inventories, meteorological data, and relevant federal and state air quality regulations to inform the design of a targeted ambient monitoring network and source testing schedule. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental consulting, optimizing air quality monitoring strategies to balance regulatory compliance, cost-effectiveness, and data quality. The professional must navigate the complexities of ambient air monitoring requirements and source testing protocols, while ensuring the collected data is scientifically sound and defensible for regulatory purposes. The challenge lies in identifying the most efficient and effective approach without compromising the integrity of the monitoring program or violating regulatory mandates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a phased strategy that begins with a thorough review of existing data and regulatory requirements. This foundational step ensures that any proposed monitoring plan is directly aligned with applicable standards, e.g., EPA National Ambient Air Quality Standards (NOx), state-specific regulations, and addresses the specific pollutants of concern. Understanding the site's historical emission, meteorological conditions, and surrounding land use is crucial for designing a targeted and efficient monitoring network. This approach minimizes unnecessary monitoring, focuses resources on areas of highest potential impact, and ensures compliance with the spirit and letter of environmental regulations. It reflects best professional practice by employing a data-driven, risk-informed methodology that is both scientifically rigorous and economically prudent. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach might involve immediately deploying a comprehensive suite of expensive, continuous monitoring equipment across the entire facility perimeter without prior assessment. This fails to meet the professional standard because it is not a process optimization strategy. It is a brute force, potentially wasteful deployment. It risks over-monitoring, incurring unnecessary costs, and may not even yield the most relevant data if the monitoring locations are not strategically chosen based on dispersion modeling or emission source identification. This approach could be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in resource allocation and could lead to non-compliance if the data collected does not adequately address the specific regulatory concerns. Another incorrect approach could be to rely solely on historical monitoring data without considering recent changes in operations, new emission sources, or updated regulatory guidance. While historical data is valuable, environmental conditions and regulatory landscapes evolve. Failing to reevaluate and adapt the monitoring plan based on current circumstances can lead to outdated or irrelevant data, potentially resulting in non-compliance or an incomplete understanding of current air quality impacts. This demonstrates a lack of proactive environmental management and a failure to adapt to changing conditions, which is a significant ethical and professional failing. A third incorrect approach might be to focus exclusively on source testing for all potential pollutants without establishing a baseline ambient air quality. Source testing provides valuable information about emissions from specific points, but it does not directly assess the impact of those emissions on the surrounding environment or the general public. Without ambient monitoring, it is difficult to determine if the emissions are exceeding ambient standards or if control measures are effectively reducing overall air quality impacts. This approach neglects the broader regulatory objective of protecting ambient air quality and could lead to a misallocation of resources, focusing on point sources while neglecting the overall environmental impact. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, phased approach to air quality monitoring optimization. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory framework and specific compliance obligations. 2. Conducting a thorough site assessment, including identifying emission sources and evaluating meteorological and topographical factors. 3. Reviewing and analyzing existing data. 4. Developing a targeted monitoring plan that strategically places ambient monitors and defines appropriate source testing protocols based on risk and regulatory requirements. 5. Implementing the plan with calibrated and well-maintained equipment. And 6. Regularly reviewing and adapting the plan based on collected data and evolving conditions. This iterative process ensures that monitoring efforts are efficient, effective, and compliant. Question 17. What factors determine the most effective and sustainable approach to mitigating indoor air quality issues in a commercial office building, considering pollutant sources, ventilation system performance, and occupant health? Option A. The installation of the most advanced air filtration technology available, irrespective of ventilation rates or source control. Option B. The number and severity of occupant complaints, regardless of the identified sources or ventilation effectiveness. Option C. A review of outdoor air quality data and a general assumption that indoor air quality mirrors outdoor conditions. Option D. A comprehensive assessment of potential indoor pollutant sources, the adequacy and operation of the building's ventilation system, and the specific health concerns reported by occupants. Correct answer is D. A comprehensive assessment of potential indoor pollutant sources, the adequacy and operation of the building's ventilation system, and the specific health concerns reported by occupants. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental professionals, CEP, in assessing indoor air quality IAQ. The complexity arises from the multifactorial nature of IAQ, where numerous potential pollutant sources, varying ventilation strategies, and occupant behaviors interact. A CEP must synthesize information from diverse sources, including building design, occupancy patterns, material inventories, and occupant complaints, to accurately diagnose IAQ issues and recommend effective mitigation. The challenge lies in prioritizing interventions, considering cost-effectiveness, occupant health, and regulatory compliance, without overlying on a single diagnostic tool or approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a systematic, evidence-based evaluation that integrates multiple lines of inquiry. This aligns with best practices in IAQ assessment, which require a comprehensive understanding of potential pollutant sources, e.g., building materials, furnishings, occupant activities, outdoor air infiltration, the effectiveness of ventilation systems, e.g., air exchange rates, filtration, distribution, and the impact of occupant behavior. A thorough assessment involves site inspections, review of building plans, interviews with occupants and building managers, and potentially targeted air sampling. This holistic approach ensures that the root causes of IAQ problems are identified and that mitigation strategies are tailored to the specific building and its occupants, thereby maximizing the likelihood of achieving sustainable improvements in IAQ and occupant well-being. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of a CEP to protect public health and the environment through sound scientific and professional judgment. Incorrect approach is analysis. Focusing solely on occupant complaints without investigating underlying sources or ventilation performance is an incomplete approach. While complaints are important indicators, they do not, by themselves, identify the cause. This can lead to misdiagnosis and ineffective or costly remediation efforts, failing to address the actual problem and potentially violating the professional duty to provide accurate assessments. Prioritizing only the installation of high-efficiency, particulate air, HEPA filters without assessing ventilation rates or source control is also problematic. While HEPA filters can reduce particulate matter, they do not address gaseous pollutants or the fundamental issues of inadequate fresh air supply or excessive pollutant generation. This approach can be a costly band-aid rather than a comprehensive solution, potentially leading to continued IAQ issues and a failure to meet the professional standard of care. Relying exclusively on outdoor air quality data to assess indoor air quality is insufficient. While outdoor air quality can influence indoor air, it does not account for indoor-specific pollutant sources, building envelope integrity, or indoor pollutant generation rates. This approach ignores critical indoor factors and can lead to a false sense of security or an inaccurate assessment of indoor conditions. Professional reasoning. When faced with IAQ concerns, a CEP should adopt a systematic decision-making process. This begins with clearly defining the scope of the assessment and gathering preliminary information, including occupant complaints, building characteristics, and known potential sources. The next step involves developing a hypothesis about potential IAQ issues and designing an investigation plan that may include visual inspections, ventilation system evaluation, and targeted sampling. The CEP must then critically analyze the collected data, correlating findings from different sources to identify root causes. Mitigation strategies should be developed based on this comprehensive understanding, prioritizing source control and effective ventilation before considering air cleaning technologies. Throughout the process, adherence to relevant professional standards, ethical guidelines, and applicable regulations is paramount. Question 18. When evaluating the environmental fate and transport of a chemical contaminant, which fundamental chemical principle provides the most direct insight into its molecular structure, polarity, and subsequent behavior in different environmental matrices? Option A. The nature of the chemical bonds between atoms within the molecule. Option B. The classification of the substance as an acid or a base. Option C. The quantitative ratios of reactants and products in potential reactions. Option D. The number of protons and electrons in the constituent atoms. Correct answer is A. The nature of the chemical bonds between atoms within the molecule. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an environmental professional by requiring them to differentiate between fundamental chemical principles and their practical implications in environmental assessment. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the core chemical concept that dictates the behavior of a substance in the environment, which directly impacts risk assessment, remediation strategies, and regulatory compliance. Misinterpreting these principles can lead to flawed environmental decisions, potentially resulting in ineffective pollution control, increased environmental damage, and noncompliance with environmental regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on the fundamental principle of chemical bonding, specifically covalent bonding, as the primary determinant of a substance's properties and environmental fate. Covalent bonds, characterized by the sharing of electrons, result in molecules with distinct structures and polarities. These molecular characteristics directly influence solubility, volatility, reactivity, and persistence in various environmental media, air, water, soil. For instance, understanding the covalent bonding in a hydrocarbon dictates its hydrophobic nature, influencing its partitioning into organic matter in soil and its potential for bioaccumulation. This deep understanding of molecular structure, derived from bonding principles, is essential for predicting environmental behavior and is a cornerstone of environmental chemistry, directly informing regulatory frameworks for chemical management and pollution control. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on atomic structure without considering how atoms combine. While atomic structure, number of protons, neutrons, electrons, defines an element, it doesn't explain how that element will interact with others to form compounds with specific environmental properties. For example, knowing the atomic structure of carbon and oxygen doesn't inherently predict the properties of carbon dioxide, CO2, versus carbon monoxide, CO, without understanding covalent bonding and molecular geometry. This approach fails to bridge the gap between elemental composition and compound behavior, leading to an incomplete environmental assessment. Another incorrect approach emphasizes chemical reactions in isolation, without grounding them in the underlying bonding principles. Chemical reactions are processes, but the asterisk types asterisk of reactions a substance undergoes and its asterisk reactivity asterisk are dictated by its molecular structure and bonding. Focusing only on reaction types, e.g., oxidation, reduction, without considering the bond strengths and electron distribution within the molecule, provides a superficial understanding. This can lead to misjudging the persistence or transformation pathways of a pollutant. For instance, understanding that a chlorinated hydrocarbon can undergo dehalogenation is important, but understanding the strength of the carbon-chlorine covalent bond and the electron density around it is crucial for predicting the conditions under which this reaction will occur and its rate. A third incorrect approach prioritizes stoichiometry without a foundational understanding of the chemical principles governing the reaction. Stoichiometry deals with the quantitative relationships between reactants and products in a chemical reaction. While important for calculating amounts in remediation or process design, it does not explain why a reaction occurs or how the substance will behave environmentally. For example, knowing the stoichiometric ratio for the combustion of methane is useful for calculating oxygen demand, but it doesn't explain methane's greenhouse gas potential, which is a function of its molecular structure and its ability to absorb infrared radiation, concepts rooted in bonding and molecular properties. Professional reasoning. Environmental professionals must adopt a hierarchical approach to understanding chemical principles. They should begin with atomic structure to identify elements, then delve into chemical bonding to understand how atoms form molecules and the resulting molecular properties. This understanding of molecular structure and bonding then informs the prediction of chemical reactions and their rates. Finally, stoichiometry can be applied to quantify these reactions when necessary. This systematic approach ensures a comprehensive and accurate assessment of chemical behavior in environmental contexts, aligning with regulatory requirements for risk assessment and management. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal that a proposed commercial development project is planned for a significant area of a temperate deciduous forest biome adjacent to a river. The environmental professional tasked with the impact assessment needs to evaluate the potential consequences of this development. Which of the following approaches best addresses the assessment of ecosystem services and ecological succession in this context? Option A. Quantify the loss of timber resources and assess the potential for reforestation of the cleared areas over a 50-year period, assuming natural regeneration will restore the biome's functions. Option B. Document the current plant and animal species present and recommend a general replanting scheme with native species, without a detailed assessment of the functional impacts on the biome services or the long-term successional trajectory. Option C. Focus primarily on the immediate physical displacement of wildlife and the aesthetic impact of removing trees, assuming that the river's natural flow will compensate for any ecological disruptions. Option D. Conduct a detailed analysis of the existing forest structure, identify key ecosystem services such as water purification, flood regulation, carbon sequestration, and habitat provision, and then evaluate how construction and operational phases of the development will impact these specific services, proposing targeted mitigation strategies. The correct answer is A. Quantify the loss of timber resources and assess the potential for reforestation of the cleared areas over a 50-year period, assuming natural regeneration will restore the biome's functions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental professional to assess the potential impacts of a proposed development on a sensitive ecosystem. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and quantifying the ecosystem services provided by the area, and then evaluating how the proposed development might disrupt these services. This necessitates a deep understanding of biome characteristics, ecological succession, and the interconnectedness of ecosystem components. The professional must balance the need for development with the imperative of environmental protection, adhering to regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that specifically identifies and quantifies the ecosystem services provided by the riparian biome. This includes evaluating services such as water filtration, flood control, habitat provision for endemic species, and carbon sequestration. The assessment must then analyze how the proposed construction activities, including land clearing, potential runoff, and altered hydrology, will directly and indirectly affect these services. This aligns with the principles of environmental impact assessment, IA, as mandated by relevant environmental regulations, which require a thorough evaluation of potential environmental consequences. By focusing on quantifiable ecosystem services and their disruption, the professional demonstrates adherence to best practices in environmental management and a commitment to informed decision-making that prioritizes ecological integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the immediate physical disturbance of the land without considering the broader ecological functions. This fails to acknowledge the concept of ecosystem services, which are the benefits humans derive from ecosystems. Regulations often require consideration of these indirect and functional impacts, not just direct habitat loss. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that the riparian biome will naturally recover over time without any specific mitigation measures, based on general principles of ecological succession. While succession is a natural process, the rate and trajectory of recovery can be significantly altered by human activities and the specific nature of the disturbance. Ignoring the need for targeted mitigation and restoration planning, which is often a regulatory requirement for significant developments, is a failure to apply best professional practice. A third incorrect approach would be to limit the assessment to the immediate area of construction, neglecting the potential downstream or wider-ranging impacts on the biome and its services. Riparian ecosystems are inherently connected, and impacts can propagate beyond the project footprint. A comprehensive assessment, as required by EIA processes, necessitates considering these broader spatial and temporal effects. Professional reasoning. Environmental professionals must adopt a systematic and science-based approach to impact assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the specific biome and its ecological characteristics. 2. Identifying all relevant ecosystem services provided by the area. 3. Quantifying baseline conditions and the value of these services. 4. Evaluating the potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of the proposed activity on these services. 5. Developing appropriate mitigation and enhancement measures based on the impact assessment findings. 6. Communicating findings clearly and transparently to stakeholders and regulatory bodies. This structured process ensures that decisions are grounded in scientific evidence and regulatory compliance, promoting sustainable development. Question 20. Quality control measures reveal that a new manufacturing facility project requires permits for air emissions, wastewater discharge, and solid waste management. Which of the following approaches best ensures comprehensive environmental compliance throughout the permitting process? Option A. Focus on obtaining the most stringent permit first, and then adapt the facility design and operations to meet the requirements of the remaining permits. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of all applicable federal, state, and local regulations for air, water, and waste, and develop an integrated permitting strategy that addresses all requirements concurrently from project inception. Option C. Develop a single, comprehensive permit application that covers all air, water, and waste aspects of the facility, assuming regulatory agencies will consolidate review. Option D. Prioritize obtaining the air permit first, as it is often the most complex, and address water and waste permits as operational needs arise. The correct answer is D. Prioritize obtaining the air permit first, as it is often the most complex, and address water and waste permits as operational needs arise. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, navigating the complexities of multiple permitting requirements for a single project. The professional challenge lies in ensuring comprehensive compliance across different environmental media, air, water, waste, while adhering to the specific regulatory frameworks governing each. Misinterpreting or overlooking requirements for any one medium can lead to significant delays, fines, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to identify all applicable regulations, understand their interdependencies, and develop a coordinated permitting strategy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic and integrated strategy for environmental permitting. By proactively identifying all potential permit needs across air, water, and waste streams early in the project lifecycle, the professional ensures that all regulatory obligations are addressed concurrently. This integrated approach minimizes the risk of unforeseen permit gaps, streamlines the application process by allowing for coordinated submissions and agency interactions, and ultimately leads to more efficient project development and compliance. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of environmental professionals to ensure full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most visible or immediately apparent permit, e.g., only addressing air emissions without considering wastewater discharge, represents a significant regulatory failure. This oversight could lead to violations of water quality standards and associated penalties. Another incorrect approach that involves applying generic best practices without consulting the specific federal, state, or local regulations for each permit type is also professionally unacceptable. This can result in noncompliance due to a lack of understanding of jurisdiction-specific requirements, thresholds, and control technologies mandated by law. Furthermore, an approach that delays addressing waste management permits until the operational phase is a critical error, as waste characterization and disposal planning are often integral to the design and permitting of facilities, and can significantly impact operational costs and environmental impact. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough project scope analysis to identify all potential environmental impacts. This should be followed by a comprehensive review of all applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations relevant to the project's activities and location. Engaging with regulatory agencies early in the process to clarify requirements and expectations is crucial. Developing a detailed permitting plan that outlines the specific permits needed, the application timelines, and the responsible parties for each ensures a systematic and compliant approach. Continuous monitoring and adaptation of the permitting strategy as the project evolves are also essential.